5 statues of kings dominate Heroes Square in Budapest. They all belong to a single family, the Arpads. For 300 years, this dynasty transformed a nomadic tribe of pagan warriors into a European Christian powerhouse. But the most extraordinary thing wasn't their conquests, it's that they produced more saints than any other royal family in history. This is the story of how they pulled it off. The Millennium Monument towers over Heroes Square in Budapest, drawing thousands of tourists every year. This structure was erected in 1895, precisely 1,000 years after the Magyars conquered the lands we know today as Hungary. The monument isn't just an impressive architectural work, it's a testament in stone to the most outstanding figures who forged Hungarian identity across the centuries. The structure consists of 14 monumental statues of Hungarian rulers and political leaders distributed across 2 symmetrical colonnades flanking the ensemble. Among these figures stand out 5 kings who belong to the illustrious Arpad dynasty. Their names resonate in Hungary's historical memory. King Saint Stephen, founder of the Christian kingdom, King Ladislaus, legendary warrior, Koloman the Wise, intellectual monarch, King Andrew II, political reformer, and King Bela IV, who rebuilt the kingdom from the ashes of devastation. The monument's construction coincided with a period of Hungarian national renewal during the 19th century. Architects Albert Sikadants and György Zala designed the complex with a very specific intention: to create a sacred space where every Hungarian could visually connect with their medieval heritage. Each statue was sculpted with an extraordinary level of detail, showing not just the faces of these monarchs, but also their characteristic attributes: swords, books, crowns, crosses. Heroes Square quickly became the symbolic heart of Budapest, a place where history stopped being abstract and became tangible. The Archangel Gabriel crowns the central column, holding the Holy Crown of Hungary in his outstretched hands. This visual representation communicates a powerful theological message. The Hungarian kingdom was established by divine will, and the Arpads were the human instruments of that celestial design. Visitors who contemplate the monument frequently experience a sensation of historical continuity, connecting Hungary's present with its glorious medieval past. The Arpad dynasty ruled Hungary for a full 300 years, from the year 1000 to 1301. This period represents a transformative era in Central European history. Among the monarchs of this family, you can find personalities of every type. The scholar who could read when other kings could barely write their name, the chivalrous one who defended Europe from Eastern invasions, the frivolous one who gave away lands without moderation, the moderate one who sought political balance, the dissolute one who caused scandals, and the saints, whose Christian virtue elevated them to the altars. If we include the family's princesses, the list of saints expands even further, making it the most sanctified dynasty in Christianity's history. But a fundamental question arises that this video will answer. What concrete contributions did the Arpad monarchs make to Hungary and to Europe? How exactly did a nomadic tribal state of the Magyars become a solid, well-organized Christian kingdom respected by the other European powers? And perhaps most intriguing, why are these 300 years considered one of the most triumphant periods in all of Hungarian history? But before we understand their greatness, we need to understand the chaos that nearly destroyed everything Saint Stephen had built. King Saint Stephen's death in 1038 triggered a crisis that threatened to undo decades of Christianization. The problem was devastatingly simple. There wasn't an obvious male heir. This absence of clear succession opened the doors to an era of great political and religious turmoil that would shake the young Christian kingdom's foundations. Several throne claimants emerged almost immediately, each claiming legitimacy based on different family connections with the dynasty. These aspirants didn't just compete in political courts, they waged real battles, armed confrontations that divided the kingdom into hostile factions. Even though the German emperor tried to intervene to stabilize the situation and impose a candidate favorable to his interests, the local claimants prevailed. They did so with the backing of rebel groups who had a very specific religious agenda. restoring the paganism that Saint Stephen had worked so hard to eradicate. German Emperor Henry III didn't passively accept his political defeat in Hungary. He organized military campaigns in 1042 and 1043, attempting to directly conquer Hungarian lands and convert the kingdom into a vassal state of the Holy Roman Empire. His armies crossed the western border, looting frontier villages and besieging Hungarian fortifications. However, the Hungarian nobles, despite their internal divisions, temporarily united against the external German threat. They repeatedly defeated the imperial forces through guerrilla tactics and ambushes in the dense forests of Transdanubia, where German heavy cavalry couldn't maneuver effectively. In 1045, Hungarian officials made a decision that would change the course of events. They sent emissaries to locate and bring back the exiled sons of Prince Vasily, who'd been banished and executed years earlier for conspiring against Saint Stephen. Dukes Andrew and Bela were considered the legitimate successors of the Arpad line. While these heirs prepared to return to Hungary in the middle of a civil war, another development threatened to completely destroy Hungarian Christianity. The chief of Vedish County, a man named Vata, had shaved his head following the ancient pagan fashion. This symbolic act was much more than a personal style statement. It represented a total rejection of Christianity and a call to the old customs. Vata began inciting an anti-Christian uprising that spread like wildfire through the rural regions. Records from the era describe disturbing scenes, people performing sacrifices dedicated to the devil and consuming horse meat, a practice forbidden by the Christian Church but common in Magyar pagan rituals. The pagan rebels didn't just attack Christian symbols, they systematically destroyed the administrative infrastructure that Saint Stephen had established. Tax records were burned, royal courts dissolved, and Christian laws publicly repudiated. In some regions, pagan leaders reinstated the ancient tribal assemblies, where Magyar elders made decisions according to pre-Christian customs. It was as if the last 30 years of state building simply evaporated, replaced by the tribal decentralization that had characterized the Magyars before Saint Stephen. Violence erupted with uncontrolled fury. Christian priests were massacred in their own churches. The king's tax collectors, symbols of the new state order, were mercilessly murdered. Churches were looted and their treasures distributed or destroyed. It was like the last 30 years of Christianization had never happened. Hungary seemed to be regressing to its previous pagan tribal identity. Vata approached Duke Andrew with a strategic proposal. He'd grant him military support to take the throne if Andrew allowed the ancient pagan customs to be freely practiced in the kingdom. Andrew found himself in a desperate position. He needed allies to defeat the other claimants and the German emperor. Strategically, he accepted the alliance with Vata, temporarily allowing the resurgence of pagan practices in exchange for the military support necessary to secure the throne. What Vata didn't know was that Andrew had very different plans once he consolidated his power. Once Andrew secured the throne and became King Andrew I, he revealed his true position. He issued a royal edict that made things absolutely clear. Subjects must immediately abandon the pagan customs he'd initially allowed, or face beheading. The message was unequivocal. Everyone had to return to the true faith of Christ and live according to the laws that King Saint Stephen had established for the kingdom. The last significant pagan rebellion was violently suppressed in 1061. However, disputes over the throne didn't end with religious pacification. They continued for an additional century, with intermittent periods of peace interrupted by new succession conflicts. Despite numerous attempts by various kings to establish primogeniture as a guaranteed succession system, Hungarian political reality functioned differently. Succession to the throne was frequently determined by the existing power balance at the moment of the monarch's death, not by clear dynastic rules. The statistics reveal the system's instability. By the end of the 12th century, only 3 of 12 Hungarian kings had inherited the throne directly from their fathers. The other 9 had come to power through civil wars, coups d'état, political alliances, or foreign interventions. The Arpad dynasty experienced constant internal conflicts, with family members fiercely competing for supreme power. These included brothers against brothers, cousins against cousins, ambitious dukes, and uncles claiming greater legitimacy than their nephews. Many of these claimants were sons of previous kings who'd been passed over in the succession. The conflict between Vasoli's sons serves as a powerful illustration of that era's political situation. Initially, King Andrew I and his younger brother Bela ruled the country jointly, managing to successfully repel attacks from the German emperor attempting to impose his influence over Hungary. This fraternal collaboration seemed promising for the kingdom's stability. However, when Andrew fell gravely ill and decided to designate his son Solomon as heir to the throne, Bela reacted with indignation. He felt betrayed. He'd fought alongside his brother, defended the kingdom, and now he was being excluded from the succession in favor of a young nephew. Andrew decided to test his brother's loyalty through a dramatic and dangerous trial. He placed two symbolic objects before Bela, a crown and a sword. He asked him to choose between them. Secretly, he'd ordered his men to kill Bela if he chose the crown, interpreting that choice as an immediate declaration of rebellion. However, Bela had been informed of this trap order by allies within the court. Cunningly, he chose the sword, apparently signaling his intention to cede the throne to Solomon and limit himself to serving as a loyal subject. But this public demonstration of loyalty wouldn't stop Bela from rebelling later. After a few years, Bela organized a military uprising, defeated King Andrew in battle, and, after his death, seized the throne directly from Solomon. However, King Bela also couldn't get his own son to inherit the throne peacefully. After his death, Andrew's son Solomon recovered the throne through the German emperor's support. Solomon also failed to permanently consolidate his royal power. His cousins, Bela's sons, eventually dethroned him in a new civil war. The internal conflict continued generation after generation, creating a pattern of instability that seemed impossible to break. But here's what's extraordinary. Despite this constant chaos, Hungary didn't descend into total anarchy. Why? Despite the recurring civil wars, the country didn't descend into complete disorder. Other European kingdoms were surprised that Hungarian nobles obeyed the king with a respect that was unusual in Western Europe of that era. In France, England, or the Holy Roman Empire, nobles frequently openly defied their monarchs. In Hungary, even during succession disputes, there existed a fundamental recognition of royal authority that maintained certain cohesion. The Hungarian monarch's superior position was also economically driven by extraordinary resources. Hungarian kings controlled more than 70% of the nation's arable lands, a concentration of property unparalleled in Europe. They possessed the exclusive right to mint coins, thus controlling the kingdom's monetary economy. Additionally, they shared with the dukes the right to recruit and maintain armies, but on a much larger scale than any individual noble. This combination of dynastic legitimacy, religious authority backed by the church, and massive economic power created a monarchy that could survive even the most violent succession disputes. But the real test of Hungarian royal power would come from a threat that didn't come from within, but from the Far East. Hit that subscribe button if you want to understand how a dynasty survived a century of civil wars, because what's coming reveals the most legendary battles in Hungarian history. During the 11th through 13th centuries, Hungary faced waves of attacks from various nomadic groups from the east. The historical irony was cruel but evident. Just as the pagan Hungarians had devastated Christian lands of Europe 100 or 200 years earlier, now other pagan conquerors threatened Christian Hungary's eastern borders. History seemed to be repeating itself, but this time the Magyars were on the defender's side. To protect itself and the rest of Western Europe from these devastating invasions, Hungary had to successively repel the Pechenegs, Cumans, and eventually the Mongols. Each of these nomadic peoples represented an existential threat to the kingdom. But in these desperate battles would emerge one of the most legendary kings of the Arpad dynasty, Ladislaus. When he was still a duke, Ladislaus distinguished himself notably in these combats against the eastern invaders.
In 1068, when the Pechenegs organized a devastating raid in Transylvania, looting villages and taking everything valuable they could find, the Duke's men intercepted them near the village of Kerles, just as the invaders were trying to escape with the riches they'd stolen and the captives they'd taken. The legend that emerged from that battle would become one of the most famous stories in Hungarian history. During combat, Duke Ladislaus spotted a Pecheneg warrior fleeing on horseback, carrying with him a beautiful young woman who'd been kidnapped from her village. Despite being wounded himself in combat, Ladislaus pursued the pagan warrior with fierce determination. However, he couldn't catch up in time before the enemy gained too much of a lead. Instead of giving up, Ladislaus shouted to the young woman with a very specific instruction. "Fair sister, grab the man by his belt and throw yourself to the ground with him." The girl, demonstrating extraordinary courage, did exactly as she was told. She grabbed the Pecheneg warrior's belt tightly and threw herself toward the ground, dragging him down with her in the fall. The warrior was disoriented by the impact. Ladislaus caught up to both and killed the invader in hand-to-hand combat, freeing the young woman. This dramatic scene has been depicted in murals of countless Hungarian churches over the following centuries, becoming a symbol of the chivalrous virtue and military valor that defined the ideal king. But this youthful feat was just the beginning of Ladislaus's legend.
King Ladislaus was highly respected not only for his bravery, but for his imposing physical presence. The chronicles describe him as an extraordinarily tall man, standing a full head above his contemporaries. In an era when average height was considerably less than today, Ladislaus must have seemed truly gigantic. Medieval accounts claim Ladislaus measured more than 2 meters in height, a colossal stature for the 11th century. When his tomb was opened in the 19th century for archaeological investigations, the bones confirmed he'd indeed been a man of extraordinary dimensions for his time. His armor, partially preserved, also suggested a warrior of massive proportions. This physical presence wasn't merely intimidating on the battlefield, it also had a profound psychological effect on allies and enemies alike, projecting an image of royal power that transcended the merely political. In combat, Ladislaus wielded a sword of equally impressive dimensions, specially forged for his large hands. Hungarian blacksmiths had created a weapon that other warriors found nearly impossible to handle efficiently, but in Ladislaus's hands became a lethal extension of his will. Legends claim he could split an enemy in full armor in 2 with a single downward blow, a feat that normally required multiple coordinated attacks. In 1091, despite being over 50 years old, a stage of life considered elderly in the 11th century, Ladislaus demonstrated that his physical vigor hadn't diminished. During an invasion of the Cuman people into Hungary, the king valiantly defeated the enemy leader in personal combat. This victory in single combat not only elevated his military prestige, but completely demoralized the invaders, who retreated after witnessing their commander's fall. The duel was fought according to the ancient traditions of steppe peoples. The Cuman leader, confident in his reputation as an invincible warrior who'd killed dozens of opponents in single combat, publicly challenged Ladislaus to face him. Refusing such a challenge would have been considered unforgivable cowardice. Ladislaus immediately accepted, dismounting from his horse and facing the Cuman warrior on foot, as was the custom. The combat lasted barely minutes. Ladislaus dodged the Cuman's first attack, exploited an opening in his defense, and brought him down with a devastating blow that fractured his skull through his iron helmet. Though his physique and combat prowess clearly distinguished him, Ladislaus possessed other equally important royal virtues. He consolidated and maintained everything his great predecessor, King St. Stephen, had managed to establish. One of his most significant actions was canonizing St. Stephen and his son, Prince Emmerich, formalizing the cult that already existed informally and strengthening the kingdom's Christian identity. Ladislaus energetically prohibited the practice of ancestral pagan beliefs that still remained alive among some sectors of the rural population. He issued very specific decrees.
Those who, according to pagan customs, performed sacrifices by wells, brought offerings to trees, springs, and stones, had to pay for their sin with an ox. This economic fine was sufficiently severe to deter the forbidden practices without resorting to mass executions. But Ladislaus didn't just defend the kingdom, he also expanded it in ways that would change the map of Central Europe forever.
He implemented draconian laws to protect private property, considering theft a most serious crime against social order. If the stolen object was worth more than a chicken, the punishment was death by hanging. This severity reflected Ladislaus's determination to establish a solid rule of law where citizens could trust in the protection of their property. During his reign, he successfully defended Hungary from Eastern invasions while simultaneously pursuing an active foreign policy. These initiatives included the conquest of other nations, the most lasting of which was Croatia. It was at the request of his sister, Queen Helena of Croatia, that Ladislaus conquered that kingdom in 1091 after succession disputes similar to those Hungary had experienced erupted. His successor, Koloman, was crowned king of Croatia in 1102. For more than 800 years, until 1918, Croatia remained under the rule of the Hungarian monarchy. This personal union between the two kingdoms would create a political entity that would dominate the Adriatic and the Balkans for centuries, becoming a crucial stabilizing factor in Central Europe. Ladislaus's successor would be completely different, not a warrior, but a scholar whom the chroniclers would try to destroy. Physically, he was weak, but cunning and quick to learn. He was unkempt, hairy, and had weak eyesight. He was hunchbacked, lame, and stuttered. That was the description a medieval chronicler gave of King Koloman. But a fundamental question arises. Was this description accurate, or did it have hidden motivations? According to modern historians, the description was completely false. The unflattering portrait didn't come from objective observation, but from political disputes that occurred during and after Koloman's reign. His younger brother, Duke Almos, tried to overthrow him on several occasions through conspiracies and armed uprisings. Koloman, demonstrating remarkable patience, generously pardoned him each time until finally his tolerance ran out. To ensure Almos was permanently disqualified from ruling according to the laws of the time, Koloman ordered that both he and his son be blinded. Blindness was considered an absolute disqualification for royalty, since a king had to be able to see his enemies and lead armies in battle. After Koloman's death, Duke Bela, later known as King Bela the Blind, and his descendants finally took the throne. The chroniclers who served the new dynasty sought posthumous revenge against Koloman, representing him unfavorably in their writings. They wanted to justify the coup d'état by painting Koloman as a physically and morally inadequate king. The Millennium Monument still portrays him with a hunchback on his back, perpetuating this medieval propaganda. However, the statue shows a more favorable, revealing detail. The king appears leaning on his books, a visual representation of his most authentic royal epithet, the wise or the learned. This nickname was given to Koloman because he could read, an extraordinarily rare skill among European monarchs of that era. A contemporary Polish chronicler observed with admiration, King Koloman of the Hungarians surpassed all the rulers of his time in learning. Initially destined for religious life, Koloman received a complete ecclesiastical education that included Latin, theology, philosophy, and canon law. However, political events led him from the cloister to the throne. His exceptional education transformed his approach to government. Koloman applied rational and legal principles to the kingdom's administration in ways his warrior predecessors had never considered. One of his most significant contributions was reforming the Hungarian legal code. He introduced laws based on evidence and testimony instead of ordeals and superstitious tests. Notably, during an era when Europe was obsessed with witch hunts, Koloman established an extraordinary law stating, "Concerning witches, since they do not exist, there shall be no investigation into them. This rationalist declaration was centuries ahead of its time, rejecting popular superstitions through simple but devastating logical reasoning. While Western Europe plunged into superstitions, Hungary under Koloman embraced reason. But the kingdom's most powerful symbol was yet to be created. King Bela III maintained exceptionally strong connections with the Byzantine Empire. He spent his youth in Constantinople, Europe's most sophisticated city, where he was educated at the Byzantine imperial court. He even became engaged to the emperor's daughter, Maria Komnena, though this marriage never took place due to political changes. However, these Eastern connections profoundly influenced his understanding of royal power and monarchical symbolism. Bela III was the first Hungarian king to establish a royal chancery that maintained systematic written records of all official documents, a common practice in Byzantium but novel in Hungary. This administrative innovation transformed Hungarian government, allowing for more efficient bureaucracy and more precise control over royal finances and lands. But his most enduring legacy is connected to the Holy Crown of Hungary, one of the most significant objects in all Hungarian history. There's a complex historical debate about the crown's exact origin. Some scholars have claimed that Pope Sylvester II sent it to King Saint Stephen in the year 1000 as recognition of his Christianization of Hungary. However, more recent research has refuted this claim, and the crown's true origin remains disputed. The most plausible explanations hold that the crown consists of two distinct parts, a lower part of Byzantine design and an upper part of Western Latin style. These sections were joined later, possibly during the 12th century, during the reign of Bela III or his immediate successors. With its semicircular arch, the cross at the top, and the dangling pendants on each side, the crown presents a remarkable resemblance to the crowns of the Greek Byzantine emperors of the era. This strongly suggests that Bela III may have played a significant role in its final design, incorporating elements of his Byzantine education into this supreme symbol of Hungarian power. King Emmerich, Bela's son, was the first to be represented with a closed crown, probably the Holy Crown, on a gold seal dated 1202. This crown would become more than a decorative symbol. It would transform into the very source of royal legitimacy. The Holy Crown served as the primary means of establishing a monarch's legitimacy until the 20th century. Throughout the Middle Ages, only those crowned with the Holy Crown by the Archbishop of Esztergom in the city of Székesfehérvár were considered legitimate Hungarian monarchs. Any other coronation ritual, no matter how elaborate, was invalid without these specific elements. This tradition created a unique political doctrine known as the Holy Crown of Hungary, where the crown itself was considered the source of political power, with the king acting merely as its temporary custodian. All inhabitants of the kingdom, from the monarch to the poorest peasant, were considered subjects of the Holy Crown, an almost mystical entity that represented the continuity of the Hungarian state. But not all of the Arpad dynasty's contributions would be so mystical. Some would be surprisingly modern and political. Smash that subscribe button if these symbols of medieval power are fascinating you, because the kingdom's most radical political transformation hasn't arrived yet. King Andrew II rewarded those loyal to him with generous gifts of properties and lands. In one of his official documents, he openly declared that, quote, "the best measure for granting properties is immoderation," end quote. This philosophy of extreme generosity may sound noble in theory, but in practice, it generated devastating political consequences. This excessive generosity wasn't universally applauded. Hungarian dignitaries deeply resented the offering of such elevated concessions and offices to the German relatives and courtiers of Queen Gertrude, who'd been born in Bavaria. They also objected that the queen, instead of the Palatine Bank, assumed the monarch's role during his absences. In medieval Hungarian society, where political hierarchies were carefully maintained, this transgression of established roles caused outrage. This discontent finally led to the queen's assassination in 1213, when Hungarian dignitaries led by the Palatine Bank killed her in a violent conspiracy. Gertrude's death shocked the kingdom and all of Europe. The king, enraged by the betrayal, ordered that one of the rebellion's leaders be impaled to death, a punishment reserved for the most horrendous crimes. However, Bank, despite his participation, ultimately went unharmed, protected by his position and powerful allies. But the soldiers of the Royal Armed Forces, the so-called Servientes Regius, were also deeply discontent. They feared losing their freedom and falling under the power of the feudal lords to whom the king had granted massive lands. Their protest movement forced the king to issue the Edict of the Golden Bull in 1222. This document would forever change the relationship between the Hungarian king and his subjects. This charter bears a gold seal and contains several revolutionary provisions, including privileges granted to the Servientes Regis. These privileges included tax exemption, protection against arrest without a prior judicial order, and no obligation to participate in wars outside the country. But the most radical clause was the so-called resistance clause. This clause granted the nobles and dignitaries the explicit right to resist and oppose the king if he violated the stipulations outlined within the document. In other words, it legally codified the right to rebellion under specific circumstances, transforming resistance from an act of treason into a constitutional right. In many respects, the Golden Bull is remarkably similar to the Magna Carta issued 7 years earlier in England in 1215. The circumstances and provisions of the two documents reveal surprising parallels in the political development between England and Hungary in establishing parliamentary institutions that limited the monarch's absolute power. Both documents arose from conflicts between kings and aristocracies demanding formalized rights. However, while the Magna Carta is world famous, the Golden Bull remains relatively unknown outside Hungary, despite being equally significant in the history of European constitutionalism. Both documents established crucial precedents. The king wasn't an absolute authority, but governed under the law, and subjects had rights that not even the monarch could violate. But all these political reforms, all these disputes over lands and rights, would soon seem trivial when an apocalyptic storm arrived from the east. The Mongols under Genghis Khan conquered vast areas of Asia during the first decades of the 13th century, creating the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever seen. In the course of a few decades, they'd conquered China, all of Central Asia, Baghdad, and the Russian principalities, expanding to the Carpathians and the Baltic Sea. This continental empire was unprecedented in human history, both in territorial extent and conquest speed. The Mongol military machine functioned with an efficiency that terrified their enemies. Every Mongol warrior was a horseman from infancy, capable of shooting arrows with deadly precision while galloping at full speed. They could cover impossible distances without rest, switching between multiple horses they carried with them. Their communication system through mounted relays allowed them to transmit messages across thousands of kilometers in days, a communication speed that Europe wouldn't achieve until the telegraph's invention. Their generals employed sophisticated military intelligence, using spies, local informants, and exhaustive reconnaissance before each campaign. Psychological terror was as important a weapon as their bows and swords. The Mongols systematically massacred entire cities that resisted, leaving only a few survivors to tell the story. These horror narratives spread faster than the Mongol armies themselves, causing some cities to surrender without fighting when they heard the Mongols were approaching. The reputation of invincibility fed itself, creating a vicious circle of fear that facilitated subsequent conquests. In Europe, the Tartars, a Turkic people of the Western Mongol Empire, had merged with the Mongols, creating a mixed but devastatingly effective military force. The ruler of the Western territories, Batu Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson, had conquered Kiev in December 1240. After destroying this city that had been the center of Eastern Slavic civilization, he turned his attention toward Hungary in the spring of 1241. The Hungarians were completely unprepared for the attack, though news about the Mongols had preceded their arrival for a long time. Friar Julian, who'd traveled east in 1236 searching for Hungarians who hadn't migrated to Europe, found Magyar communities west of the Ural Mountains. He returned a year later, only to discover that the Mongols had destroyed all the Magyar settlements he'd visited. No one was left alive. On his return to Hungary, Julian delivered a letter to King Bela IV directly from Batu Khan. The message was brutally simple: immediate and unconditional surrender. The king tried to take measures to protect himself and prepare the kingdom for war, but the support of Hungarian dignitaries was lukewarm at best. Bela IV wasn't a popular ruler. The king's unpopularity was about to cost him everything. Bela's intention to recover the ancient royal properties that had been given away by his father Andrew II caused deep resentment among the landowners, who now considered themselves legitimate owners of those lands. Additionally, his prohibition that anyone sit in his presence alienated high-ranking dignitaries who'd previously enjoyed this privilege at the courts of previous kings. These nobles would secretly delight in seeing the arrogant king learn a humiliating lesson at the Mongols' hands. Although Bela tried to increase his military power by welcoming to the country the Cumans who were fleeing from the Mongols, the radical difference in lifestyle between the sedentary agricultural Hungarians and the nomadic Cumans led to almost immediate open hostility. The cultural tensions were insurmountable. The Cumans camped with their herds, refused to live in permanent houses, and maintained customs the Hungarians considered barbaric. In the end, the Hungarians, in an act of paranoia and xenophobia, murdered the Cuman prince just as Batu Khan was attacking. The Cumans, enraged by this treacherous murder, abandoned Hungary, devastating everything in their path during their retreat. They left precisely when their military help was most desperately needed. Hungary would face alone the most lethal military machine the world had ever known. In the spring of 1241, a small faction of the Mongol army entered the country from the north and through the Transylvanian passes, while the main army, led by Batu Khan, crossed the Hungarian border at the Verechk Pass. The Mongols advanced in multiple coordinated columns, a tactic that confused the defenders about where to concentrate their forces. The Hungarians made fundamental tactical errors from the start. They divided their forces, trying to defend multiple points simultaneously, diluting their military power. Archbishop Ugrin suggested concentrating all troops in a single massive formation, but was ignored by commanders, who over-relied on traditional tactics that had worked against European enemies. The Mongols, however, weren't a conventional European enemy. They employed strategic feints, simulated retreats to ambush pursuers, and flanking maneuvers impossible for Hungarian heavy cavalry. On April 11, 1241, the Hungarian royal army clashed with the Mongols at Muhi on the Sajo River. This date would be etched in Hungarian memory as one of the darkest days in its history. Although the Hungarians initially managed to repel the enemy attempting to cross the Sajo Bridge, demonstrating they could face them in direct combat, the Mongols possessed a tactical flexibility that Europeans hadn't encountered before. The Mongols crossed the river fords under cover of night, a movement the Hungarians didn't anticipate because they considered those fords too deep to cross with horses and heavy military equipment. But the Mongols, masters at cavalry operations, achieved the impossible. By morning, the Hungarian army was completely surrounded and overwhelmed. What followed was a systematic massacre. The Palatine, 2 archbishops, and 3 bishops were killed in battle or during the subsequent pursuit. King Bela IV escaped with great difficulty, fleeing while watching his army be annihilated. But the battle was just the beginning of the horror. Horrific destruction was unleashed upon the defenseless country. Mongol armies razed settlements throughout the land, taking livestock, capturing prisoners, and killing countless people. The number of those massacred is estimated at hundreds of thousands, a devastating figure for medieval Hungary's population. Only stone castles offered refuge. Those fortunate enough to reach these fortifications survived. The others faced death or slavery. The Mongols employed systematic terror tactics. They burned villages, publicly executed community leaders, and deported entire populations as slaves. A German yearbook recorded the events of 1241 with a statement that resonated throughout Christian Europe. In this year, Hungary, which had existed for 350 years, was destroyed by the Tartar horde. The Arpad kingdom, which had survived German invasions, pagan rebellions, civil wars, and dynastic conflicts, seemed to have reached its apocalyptic end. All of Europe expected total annihilation. But then, something unexpected happened. The German chronicler's statement proved premature. Batu Khan unexpectedly withdrew from the country in 1242. Historians still debate the exact reasons: the Great Khan's death in Mongolia, requiring Batu's return for succession elections, resource exhaustion in a devastated country, or simply that Hungary had been sufficiently punished. Bela IV, who'd sought refuge in Dalmatia on the Adriatic, far from Mongol reach, began Hungary's reconstruction immediately. He abandoned his short-sighted property recovery policy and instead generously rewarded those dignitaries who erected stone fortresses. This strategic change transformed Hungary's defensive landscape. He called the Cumans back and settled them between the Danube and the Tisa, where their descendants still reside to this day, preserving their unique ethnic identity within Hungary. This reconciliation with the Cumans not only increased the devastated kingdom's population, but provided an invaluable light cavalry force for future defenses. Hungary recovered quickly, faster than anyone had imagined possible. When the Mongols organized another attack in 1285, the Hungarian armies, now prepared and fortified, successfully repelled them. The Mongols never returned. The Hungarian phoenix had risen from the ashes, stronger and more resilient. However, the trauma of the Mongol invasion endured in the nation's memory for centuries. Even in the first half of the 20th century, Hungarian mothers scared their children with tales that the Tartars would take them away if they misbehaved. The terror of 1241 was never completely forgotten. But the Arpad dynasty wouldn't be remembered only for wars and devastation. Their most extraordinary legacy was in a completely different realm.
Perhaps no royal family in all of Christianity's history has contributed as many saints to the church as the House of Arpad. This extraordinary concentration of officially recognized sanctity in a single dynasty has no parallel in medieval European history. In addition to Kings Ladislaus and Stephen, whose canonizations formalized the cult that already existed at the popular level, the latter's son, Prince Emmerich, was also canonized. Emmerich was renowned for his virtuous abstinence, having taken vows of celibacy despite being married for dynastic reasons. Medieval chronicles present him as a model of Christian purity, a prince who renounced worldly pleasures to dedicate himself completely to spiritual life. His premature death at 24 converted him into a symbolic martyr of virtue over temptation. Christian virtue wasn't limited to the family's men. Piroska, King Ladislaus' daughter, became a saint of the Eastern Church as Byzantine empress. After marrying Emperor John II Comnenus, Piroska adopted the Greek name Irene and dedicated her life to charitable works in Constantinople. She founded hospitals, orphanages, and monasteries, distributing imperial wealth among the Byzantine capital's poor. During her life in Constantinople, Irene, Piroska, transformed Byzantine imperial philanthropy. She established the Pantocrator Monastery, a complex that served not only as a religious center, but also as a public hospital, where the poor received free medical treatment. This medical institution was extraordinarily advanced for its time, with separate departments for different diseases, specialized physicians, and an administration system that guaranteed continuous care. Its model influenced the development of Christian hospitals throughout the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries afterward. In Western Europe, the best-known Hungarian saint is Elizabeth, King Andrew II's daughter. Elizabeth tirelessly supported the poor in Thuringia, where she'd married Landgrave Louis IV. After being widowed at 20, she rejected the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II's marriage proposal, choosing instead a life of service to the dispossessed. Elizabeth established hospitals, distributed her own wealth among the needy, and personally cared for the sick, an activity considered scandalous for a royal princess. Her spiritual radicalism led her to adopt Franciscan poverty, completely renouncing her aristocratic privileges. She was canonized just 4 years after her death, an extraordinarily fast process that reflected immediate recognition of her sanctity. Stories about Elizabeth reveal a woman of extraordinary conviction. It's told that she once carried bread hidden in her cloak to distribute among the poor, violating her mother-in-law's orders that prohibited such acts of charity. When she was confronted and required to show what she carried hidden, the bread miraculously transformed into roses. This miracle of the roses became one of the most famous associated with any medieval saint, depicted in countless works of art. Elizabeth also personally washed and bandaged lepers' wounds, a disease so feared in the Middle Ages that the sick were completely segregated from normal society.
Some scholars believe that Saint Margaret of Scotland, born in Mekçeknadasht, Hungary, also descended from the house of Arpad. This theory is based on the possibility that her mother, Agatha, was Saint Stephen's daughter. If this connection is correct, then the Arpad dynasty also contributed to the sanctification of the Scottish monarchy, extending its spiritual influence beyond Central Europe. King Bela IV's daughter, Saint Margaret, also deserves special mention. Born during the Mongol invasion in desperate circumstances, the king offered her to God in exchange for Hungary's salvation. This vow wasn't taken lightly. When the battle ended and Hungary began its reconstruction, Margaret retired to the island that today bears her name, Margaret Island in the Danube in Budapest, where she chose to live a penitential existence. She rejected marriage proposals from both the Czech king and the Polish king, despite her parents' persistent attempts to persuade her to accept these politically advantageous alliances. Margaret insisted she'd been consecrated to God since birth, and that breaking that vow would bring calamities upon Hungary. She lived in a Dominican convent, practicing extreme austerities that scandalized even the most devout nuns. The testimonies of nuns who lived with Margaret reveal the extent of her self-punishment. She slept on the bare stone floor, fasted for complete days, and regularly flagellated herself. She insisted on performing the convent's most humble work, cleaning latrines, washing dirty laundry, and serving sick nuns. When royal ambassadors arrived with advantageous marriage proposals, Margaret received them barefoot in worn clothing, having spent the previous night in continuous prayer. This visual demonstration of her religious commitment eventually convinced even her father to respect her vows. However, Margaret wasn't the last of the Arpad family to be canonized. Her sister Kinga, another of Bela IV's daughters, married Polish Prince Boleslaus V the Chaste and built hospitals, churches, and monasteries throughout Poland. Their marriage was famous for being celibate, with both spouses dedicating themselves to pious works instead of producing heirs. Kinga was canonized by Pope John Paul II in 1999, more than 700 years after her death, demonstrating that recognition of Arpad's sanctity continues even in the modern era. But all dynasties, even the holiest ones, eventually come to an end. Andrew III, the last king of the Arpad dynasty, lived barely 2 weeks into the 14th century. He died on January 14, 1301, symbolically marking the end of an era. With his death, the dynasty that had ruled Hungary for 400 years reached its definitive conclusion. During the Arpad reign, spanning from the year 1000 to 1301, Hungary completely transformed. The nomadic principality that had terrorized Western Europe through devastating raids became a dominant Christian state in Central Europe. Integration into medieval Europe was achieved through economy, society, and culture, transforming the Magyars from feared pagan warriors into Christian defenders of European civilization. The Arpad's legacy wasn't measured only in conquered territories or battles won. It was measured in the fundamental transformation of Hungarian identity. They had established a kingdom that survived Mongol invasions, resisted German imperial pressures, and created political institutions comparable to those of England and France. They had produced an unprecedented concentration of saints, demonstrating that political power and spiritual virtue could coexist in a single family. The holy crown they consolidated would continue being the supreme symbol of Hungarian sovereignty for more than 700 additional years. The institutions they established, from the royal chancery to the defensive castle system, would form the basis of the late medieval and early modern Hungarian state. The laws they promulgated, especially the Golden Bull, established constitutional precedents that limited the monarch's absolute power. The Arpad dynasty transformed a nomadic threat into a stable Christian kingdom, an achievement that few peoples in history have replicated with such success. Their story is the tale of a complete civilizational transformation, from the steppe to the cathedral, from raid to diplomacy, from tribalism to nation-state. And when their end finally came in 1301, they left behind a consolidated kingdom, a flourishing church, and a legacy of saints that would continue inspiring Hungarians for centuries to come.
Drop a like and hit subscribe if this transformation from a nomadic tribe into a dynasty of saints got you thinking. Because every week we break down the most extraordinary stories from world history that changed the course of civilization.